Welcome everyone to session 3 of our 3-part series on helping to take AI from idea into production and ultimately business success. Today's session 3 will focus on executing against that roadmap, specifically around bringing AI workloads from POV into production and scale out across your organizations. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have questions throughout the discussion, we'll look to answer those either depending on real time, but probably most likely towards the end of the actual session. Please enter those questions in the Q&A widget of the platform, and we'll make sure that we get to them. For joining live today, we know many of you are probably somewhat close to your lunch hour. We'll be providing a Uber Eats gift card within 24 hours as a thank you for joining us for the session today. And you'll also receive a raffle entry into our year subscription to ButcherBox, excuse me, which we'll announce within the week. Post this session, all 3 of these series will be available in video on demand, and links will be sent to everyone participating post the event. And then lastly, but certainly not least, thank you to Dell Technologies for your support of the series and sponsorship broadly in our collective AI efforts with clients. So with that, I want to get a brief introduction to Mike and I as to why we're in a position today to talk to you about this particular topic, and then get right into the meat of the subject. So Mike, can you give yourself a little introduction?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. So I'm a field CTO at a head working directly on Josh's team, and have had the great pleasure of doing a lot with our go-to-market strategy around AI and customer engagement in the space, and happy to share some of what we've learned with you today.
Perfect. And then I'm Josh Perkins. I look after our AI program at Ahead and help our teams work with clients both on projects for their organizations, as well as efforts around our own internal efforts around AI to make working with Ahead easier, better, and more efficient. So as I mentioned, today we really want to talk about crossing the chasm, that is really bolstering those good ideas from a series of pilots into production-ready deployable scenarios across your enterprise. And in doing so, we really want to focus on kind of 3 key areas, most of which really aren't that technology-oriented at their core. And those 3 are really about what are the process changes that are going to be required at an overall AI program level to allow kind of cross-functional collaboration and teams management across your organization, to help increase the velocity with which you can start bringing these things to bear and generate actual value from AI. We want to talk about the operational changes needed that are involved when you're actually deploying AI models and integrating them into your enterprise application ecosystem. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we want to talk about the requirements for change management. All too often, we see this as magical tools being brought forth into the organization, but it's going to require a lot of both literacy improvements and upskilling across the organization, and a tremendous amount of enablement, frankly, in the usage of those particular tools to ensure that we're really getting the value out of them that everyone hoped we would when they started building them and seeking to deploy them across the organization broadly.
Yeah, and I think to understand how we get to full spectrum adoption of AI at scale and how we do this, a little bit of background on what we talked about before, and then differentiating from where we started to where we are today to bring it all together. So we spent time in the first session talking about use case identification, how to conduct POVs, identify KPIs, and ensure that that value is adequate to what the business was looking for in an AI tool set or endeavor. But as we go forward, we have to tie this together with the areas that are more in the blue bubbles that you see today. So how do we deploy successful after POVs? How do we do operations and integration? You're going to hear more today about the AI Innovation Hub program and how we build a flywheel approach to iterate and get better as we go through the process of identifying the AI capabilities we want to deploy. And then business process and design to skill, uplift, hire talent, and make sure that we have the tools that we need to do this. And then the AI platform modernization and infrastructure. Like most things, the best case scenario for AI is starting with the great use case that's been well identified and actually has provable value. And then from there, you're going to learn more with how we integrate into the pillars to help this be successful. So an important part here is, how do we absorb AI in the first place? We have the idea of products, public and private, and a lot of AI needs don't come down to anything that anybody has to build. And how we go forward and look at how do we operationalize and put guardrails and control around this really comes into play with where we ultimately going to be running our AI initiatives from. When I go talk to customers today, the key example I give is if you have a use case that is not unique to you, and more importantly, it's not unique to organizations similar to you, but even organizations in different verticals altogether, we're usually looking at a product play. We're looking to evaluate AI startups or AI companies, or even integrations in products you already own to be able to embrace them and use them to get the AI benefits that you have. And when we're looking at products, a lot of the things that we have to be aware of become an attribute of third-party vendor management, third-party risk management, and understanding how those tools play in the ecosystem of the environment that we already have. We go over to the right one more step and we look at public. And to be clear, public does not necessarily mean public cloud, but publicly available. And similarly, private does not mean private infrastructure, but private instance. And when we get to our generic use cases where we want general efficiency capability for our employees, our users, and our workforce, or we're looking at large monolithic models that need to do very generic use cases, think of things like Copilot or GitHub Copilot or OpenAI. We're all familiar with ChatGPT. A lot of the governance attributes of this and a lot of the scale and life cycle are going to be taken care of by the base companies that are building and managing these platforms. And you have to start thinking about the things that they don't do as they come into your environment and the risk that they bring into the controls, how you structure data, the access they give it. And then when we go over to the right is where there's more responsibility for the organization to understand fully what's required to run this at scale. When you start building infrastructure, bringing in models that you may modify, do fine tuning, or integrate into larger model ecosystems, and you have to start managing the full end life cycle of how these applications get built and stitched together, it has a direct implication on how we have to manage these when we go into day 2 operations after deployment.
I think that's great points. And frankly, we're going to see a tremendous number of different tools coming into the ecosystem and approaches. So at Ahead, we're really thinking about this more from the perspective of not which one of those pillars you're going to work with, but what across those pillars are ultimately going to come into the environment based on the use cases that your organization provides in terms of things aligned to the value creation that they're looking for. And in doing so, it became pretty obvious to us in working with clients that we needed to start adopting what we call more of an AI operating model approach, which were the pillars across a program that we could leverage and start to mature in parallel to support an organization's aspirations around AI. And frankly, what we came up with and work with clients is there's really kind of 10 key areas of focus that we need to think through. Now, ultimately, most organizations aren't going to be able to materially mature from level 0 to level 5 in short order across all of these particular components. But there are specific points in time where more focus on one or a few of them become really critical to being able to advance the specific efforts. So if we think about this from the perspective of the webinar series, we really want to look at this and say, in session 1, for those of you that attended, we really worked on this concept of defining an alignment to use cases, which really focus on the business alignment, data engineering, and data science domains within that operating model. In session 2, we were talking about deploying and developing your hybrid AI architecture, which was really around the technology platforms and estates and the distribution of those particular technology platforms in direct alignment to that life cycle that Mike talked about earlier. And then today, we're going to focus on, frankly, the other 6 categories, which we see as probably being some of the harder things organizations are going to have to kind of deal with once they get past the technology layer to start really thinking about the implications of using and embedding and building around the functionality that AI can potentially provide. And we think about this in those 3 categories again. What are process level change areas that your organization needs to concern themselves with? And this may also include things that we haven't traditionally really thought about when we're evaluating technology solutions. There's an entire subset of areas around ethics and safety and responsible use, which frankly have not been in the traditional vernacular of a lot of our interpretation of enterprise applications and technology stacks. And then there are operational implications across all of that, which obviously go from things on the security side all the way through different modes of operational needs and lifecycle management, and ultimately downward all the way into the consumption layer. And then lastly, what are the implications, like in any technology achievements, around change management and dealing with the integration changes required to accomplish that? And when we think about this, it's not just that there's a bunch of high level discussion, right? It's not an academic exercise. It's really a series of different steps, frameworks, components, elements that need to be developed or derived from work that's going on, many of which we do see as downstream, reactive to those first set of use cases that ultimately you're bringing into the organization. So to Mike's point around, like, if we're looking at products as an example, we may need to work very handedly on the front of that around third-party risk management, as opposed to necessarily components of internal risk components that were required when we're building or deploying our own models. And so we need to be very responsive to ultimately how that looks. And from a process perspective, we're typically starting all the way from the concept of intake management and the thought process around prioritization, project sponsorship, selection, and alignment to those particular pieces, all the way down through things like broader program governance for your kind of AI program, broadly speaking. And then on the operational side, we're looking at things like, what does it take after we deploy something to operationalize the use of that model, that product, that environment broadly, so that we can start getting actual business value and consumption across those platforms moving forward. But to do that, we also have new implications around the actual platforms required to operate underneath these tools. And those may require new skills, new monitoring, new observability, new metrics, frankly, in order to equip our teams to help us make sure that those are in a healthy state as they become embedded and critical to the operations of our businesses. And then certainly, but last but not least, we're looking at this from the perspective of how do we ingrain these particular types of tools in our current workflows, or imagine completely new business processes as a side effect of our development of these tools, and what are the implications on both our security process elements and our audits and controls, but also our ability to maintain, understand, and operate these particular elements in a secured apparatus.
And while we're not going to go too deep in the actual functioning and building of a large language model enabled application, we wanted to talk about control frameworks and the things that users and people in this environment need to be aware of as you go through and wrap your mind around how do we work successfully in this space, being that it's highly differentiated from different applications that we built in the past, and the workflows are often very different. So if you look at the example control framework you have in front of you, we're used to going to something like ChatGPT or Copilot and asking a question, but we're often obfuscated from what's happening in the background to ensure that the answers we get back are relevant, rational, and correct and can be trusted. And we have to start thinking of things about, how does our prompt work? How do we control what users can and cannot put into that prompt? And what action do we take from a logging and alerting perspective if something violates company policy in that? And that prompt could be multimodal. Don't limit it to chatbot, but it could be video, it could be audio, it could be email, it could be anything you've built into your application. And when you start looking at the governance attributes as it comes to traditional data structure, and security, know that large language models fundamentally work different than rows and columns. In the nature of a vectorized database, I oftentimes lose the direct permission capability I have of, for example, Mike Menke can't access HR data, but the large language model, to be successful in an application, very much needs to have access to that. So we get to the governance structure of what data comes down by understanding what data is pertinent to the actual application that we're making at the time. And then how does that interact with the actual large language models that we have to do? Are we doing fine tuning with that knowledge to get actual vector relationships more closely aligned to the outcomes that we want? Is it a retrieval augmented generation use case where we're pulling from that data? And then oftentimes this data is retrieved even if the end user isn't supposed to have access to that. So the post-processing methodology that has to be evaluated to ensure that we're both delivering a response that's rational, reasonable, but more importantly, one that the end user is allowed to have access to in the first place. And then ultimately, how do we put that back and give that to the person who interacted with the application in the first place? And I think one of the things that makes large language models and application development against them more unique is large language models are point in time. We have to, for the first time, figure out how to bring lifecycle management into an application that didn't exist previously. We all know that as data changes and things age out, the base model is no longer as relevant as it was before. And the same thing for our enterprise data that we interact and bring into these systems. We have to start wrapping our head around how do we manage the life cycle of that so that we have a perpetual shift to the right over time as the application matures. And it brings a lot of thought and a lot of process that in traditional app development necessarily didn't have to exist.
I think it's a good point. And I also think that we can't shortcut the fact that human evaluation of output still plays a major role in most production implementations that we see today. So things like human in the loop are still going to be core components for the foreseeable future as we look for mechanisms to more automate the evaluation and compliance of specific outputs as these things become deployed at scale. And I think one of the patterns that we see kind of emerging for clients that are really starting to take this with a level of seriousness and getting beyond those kind of first couple of use cases and evaluations is the formation of what we would call an AI innovation hub. And this to us is all about the fact that there needs to be a dramatic increase in the collaboration across many different functions within the organization to be able to set standards and align governance policies in such a way that it becomes non-blocking to the momentum of different use case development, but also allows for the prioritization of efforts and measurement of those efforts in an appropriate and well-aligned way to the business strategy more broadly. And so this formation really looks at things like how do we help build out over time an appropriate AI strategy and institutionalize these governance practices in such a way that people don't need to try to ascertain all of those things independently every time as they bring particular needs. It helps us think through a streamlined intake process. So it's one thing to be evaluating single use cases at the front end in pilots. It's an entirely different thing when you open that aperture to the entire organization and you start seeing an ideation funnel in the hundreds of potential use cases that then need to be thought through and prioritized and measured around along the axes of not just value and feasibility, but also obviously risk. And then we talked in our other sessions around this idea that how important a culture of experimentation ultimately is in the AI realm. And this is really important because we still see the statistics coming out of Gartner and others that upwards of 80% of all AI projects fail at this point. And I don't really see that as a design flaw. When we kind of think about it ahead, what we're really saying is we're looking through a lot of different opportunities and we're trying to match methods and thought processes to what's possible today. And in order to be okay with that, we have to be able to take kind of leaps. We have to be okay with the idea that not everything that our teams toil against will be ready to go from that proof of concept into a production level estate. But the earlier that we can start putting in specific guardrails or specific guidance around what we see consistently making it from POV to production, it will make it easier for us to both rationalize those investments in that time, but also to pick winners earlier in that process. And then when we start looking at this, we see that these teams also become really, really key to the concept of testing, evaluation, and delivery. And we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically in a couple of minutes. And then the last one is it helps create a curriculum and guidance around those enablement programs that we mentioned are going to be really, really critical to ensure that we get the right type of use out of it. So what kind of roles do we typically see participating in this type of an innovation hub? And while the structure does vary slightly, so we're not trying to be overly opinionated in terms of this, the reality is we do see the vast majority of these types of roles needing to be involved, at least in the early days, in order to set up that kind of governance structure and core standards in the beginning. And then we see them kind of ad hoc being involved in things like the advisory console concept and the center of excellence pieces in order to make sure that we're maintaining that governance over the longer haul. But the key here is to recognize that whether we're bringing in products and we need to lean on third-party management, or whether we're deploying these particular models and workloads into a production environment that's maybe heavily regulated, we need to be bringing in people like legal and compliance and risk teams in order to assert earlier on, as opposed to be kind of a no, right, go, no go at the very end of the process. So we see this as a mechanism to integrate that conjecture and collaboration as early in the process as humanly possible, with the aims of making sure that we're like hearing those voices and embedding those in institutional ways, such that people that are trying to figure out how to implement these changes in technologies to serve their specific line of business needs aren't having to make these decisions at the lower levels as they go through those processes.
And when we build this out, the idea is to build a flywheel approach to this. Anything that an organization has never done, and more importantly, anything that personally you've ever done that was new to you, is often hard, whether it's trying to figure out how to get into shape, pick up woodworking, a new hobby. Going and figuring out how to work with AI at scale is absolutely no different. And we spent a lot of time prior to this meeting through use case and pattern identification. And then now we want to talk about what's after that. And each of these is independently represented because each of them are things that can be iterated on. And while potentially painful the first time, in at best case, a learning experience, the idea is iteration will improve these, efficacy will improve, and the end result will improve. So if you think of identifying data, the knowns and the unknowns, it's often for people to think they have to boil the ocean from a traditional data governance perspective before they can start generative AI projects. And we spend a lot of time telling people that find your use case, understand the trickle down effect of what data is in scope, and then learn how to manage that data appropriately to the use case. And the first time you do that, it's going to necessarily be difficult. But every time you do that after that, you get into that rhythm and you know how to integrate with that data. And you go right below it and you look at cross-reference existing frameworks. And at some point, you may find that you have overlapping data and you've done the work already. And maybe it's minor modifications for how that data may be used differently. Similar to how do you align with the models and the architectures that you're going to work with. It's a bit of an arduous task to understand, do I need big iron? Do I need little iron? Am I going to do this on the edge? Is this going to be a monolithic model? Is it going to be API driven? Is it going to be a lot of smaller models coming together as a composition? And as we get that, we build off of the prior art, just like anything else we've done. I mean, woodworking is a great example. I build one table, I can build 10. Every one is going to get slightly better until I wake up and it's beautiful. And governance is the same thing. And the point of the iteration is we get through this, and ideally we learn from it every single time. And the organization adopts a framework for evaluating AI, evaluating the risks, the governance, the concerns, and the life cycle of that AI, and everybody who needs to be in the critical path for success. So at the end of this, we become fairly proficient. And I think one area to point out here is pilot and user testing. And I think we've learned that internally, where organizations all too often are picking their super users or their more advanced users to go pick apart and use some of these tooling. And you get to production and realize you still have to go further back into this iterative loop because you've identified that you built for the 1%, not the 100%. And so as you look at this, even having differentiation or even tiers to testing so that you can go from your users who are going to be more adept at finding perhaps technical bugs, and then find your users who are going to be more sensitive to UX, CX. But I would take this as the Innovation Hub builds a framework that get better over time, build it into muscle memory, and get to the point where it's just a core part of doing business within the organization.
Perfect. And I think that, one of the things that we see is just that adoption becomes a clear challenge within organizations. So you've built something, you've put it through that process, and ultimately now it's time for people to start using it, and we still see challenges. And so I think the couple of key takeaways that we have here really fall into kind of these three kind of categories. The first one is what we call alignment. And what we mean by alignment in this particular regard is a kind of a two-in-the-box mechanism. How closely can we align the SMEs, the subject matter experts from the line of business, from the actual business side in general, the core user of the technology, with the technology teams in order to be as responsive and humanly possible. And I see those as equally weighted in terms of the likelihood of success. The second component of alignment is the fact that we need to be thinking about adoption of the actual tools as a component of the development of those tools themselves. So it's not just something that we focus on after we're ready to go. It's something that we need to be thinking through and embedding in the feedback loops as we're going through those pilots and development. And the best way that we can kind of express this is the fact that good UI is pretty critical, right? Not only from an adoption perspective, but frankly, from our ability to then elicit feedback, right, and change through those particular deployments as well. And ultimately, the last part of the alignment lesson would really be the idea that we need to be thinking about change management plans and our lifecycle planning as a component of that adoption. So if we too frequently make changes in the early phases or feature deployments in the early phases of adoption, we could actually turn users off. But in the same regard, if we haven't thought through core functionality and as part of that initial rollout, we may actually sour the user, right, to the broader adoption of the particular tools. And that kind of brings us to the evaluation phase. Now, I think everybody's pretty used to the idea of putting together criteria and KPI and success metrics as part of POVs or pilots. But when we're talking about evaluation in this regard, we're really talking about the longer term and continuous evaluation of those deployments. And I'd say the lessons here are really things like, one, don't assume that general benchmarks in AI are going to have applied value in your organization. So just because particular models score really, really well in an MMLU doesn't mean you need to do less evaluation around efficacy and fitness for use and frankly, real world application within your applied use cases over the long haul. And it doesn't mean that once you deploy it, you get to stop doing those things. If anything, to Mike's point earlier around the idea that these models often are point in time, the reality is we need to constantly evaluate that efficacy, not just when we make major changes like plugging a new model in, but frankly, as we drift away from the initial launch of that model over time. I think to his point too, which was really the like, don't worry too much about the idea of having gold standards for data through this whole process. I think ultimately, while it would be amazing if as enterprises we had purely clean data products to be subjecting to these tools, often the tools themselves can help us make up for some of those kind of core challenges and really smooth out some of those inefficiencies with our end users. And then I think the other piece for evaluation, in order to really get something into like broad production use, is that we need to be very, very clear around what the specific criteria and success metrics are around the expectations for that deployment. So one of the things that we get a lot is like, this isn't performing the way that we expected it to. But then when we follow up on that and ask, well, what were the particular expectations from the actual end user? It becomes really murky. And so that sets everybody up kind of for squishiness or potential failure through the deployment of these particular platforms. And then the last is tech stack. And what we don't mean here is just the infrastructure, right, or platform layer. What we mean here is don't do the same work duplicatively over and over again. So how do we focus on this idea of composable or combinatory AI efforts? And then how do we expose the organization to work that's already been done so that people can consume it and integrate it with things that they'd like to do or take advantage of, as opposed to consistently recreating those efforts over and over again? And that, I think, kind of falls directly into the bucket of what we would call why enablement is so critical around this. So the first thing that we've probably spent the last, I don't know, like 18, 24 months really working with clients on is this concept of AI literacy across the organization. And in the early phases of kind of post-Chat GPT release, I would say a lot of time was being spent at board and executive level discussions to really make sure that people understood what these technologies are, right? And what they can be useful at, and what they're really not good at necessarily, more importantly. And now we need to continue to permeate that, not because our users aren't exposed to many of these tools. In fact, much like email back in the day, many of our users across our enterprises have been exposed to these tools on a personalized basis through Google, through Microsoft, right? Through their own personal use of tools like ChatGPT. So the expectation isn't that we're coming in completely fresh, but we do want to make sure that we're operating off of a common level of literacy and a common glossary of information as we start deploying these tools out in the environment. And while that general enablement is kind of a good foundation or good base, what we don't want to shy away from is the fact that every time we deploy a new capability, we need to double down around the enablement for that specific capability. Again, what it's good for, how it's different from what they do today, and embed that in our change management plans. I'll give you a really good example. Here at Ahead internally, about 14 months ago, we deployed our first RAG instance, a retrieval augmented generation instance across our environment. And part of the pilot of that particular group, before we were trying to get it to kind of full-fledged production, we started logging the inputs and outputs of that tool for a number of different reasons. But one of them was to try to understand how our users interacted, right, with that particular tool. And that would help us build better enablement around how they prompted and kind of dealt with the information. And what we saw too often was that if they didn't have a substantial amount of kind of enablement on the front end, they defaulted to particular usage patterns of things like search. Like, think I went on Google and I just typed in keywords. And frankly, RAG tools don't perform particularly well if you're just doing keyword prompts. And so we really need to think about what the downstream adoption and usage patterns are, and then use that to build a core curriculum around usage enablement as we deploy these new functions across the enterprise.
Well, I think what I would add is also people don't know how to communicate with brevity often. We go through academia and it's how do we get the right number of words to appease the professor we have for the class we're taking. And the byproduct of this is training people that you have to ask a very direct question. You have to add subtext to it to get what you're looking for. And I personally am optimistic that this is going to flow through every email in my inbox. And I'm going to know exactly what people want to ask me in the future. I think the other AI literacy thing, and we still deal with it today, is there's still a misconception that AI is brand new. And I would say 95% of the conversations that Josh or myself get brought into, and devolve is the wrong word, but we wind up encapsulating traditional ML and DL principles and realizing that generative AI has just had a feverish reignitement over how do we use AI in general, and educating people that it's not just the new stuff. Oftentimes it's the things that have been around for a long time are what they're looking for to accomplish the problem they have in front of them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think it's the Promethean moment scenario that I think ChatGPT created, that fervor around this new capability that ultimately got people excited again. But certainly there's decades now, right, of good work in the more traditional landscape that we now see organizations starting to look at again, right, as core components of what they ultimately want to accomplish with AI. I think the other kind of point I would just make in this too is when we say broad AI literacy, we really mean broad AI literacy. Like, we're talking 101 level commitment from across the organization, right? From the janitor to the CEO, we really need people to understand basic things about these types of technology capabilities, because ultimately the best ideas that ultimately come to fruition tend to be, from people most proximal to the challenges that we're trying to resolve, right? These aren't technologist-led discussions in most circumstances. They're people that understand the problem coming to technology for a solution. And so the better we can get them to understand what's real and what's not real, the greater the likelihood we're going to get really valuable, highly production grade systems as a side effect of that information.
So this is my favorite part of the topic I get to talk about all the time. And it's not because I like really big blinky lights and big iron. It's that the world has pivoted towards, I'd like to buy an AI, please. And then you have to slow them down and have the conversation of, great, what do you want your AI to do? And I use these words to be funny, but it's the workload is really driven by the use case. And the type of use case really drives the locality to the data. There are AI workloads that absolutely cannot function centralized. The latency implications, the type of data, just necessitate that it has to be adjacent to where the work is being done. So it really does start with the use case. Without a well-formed use case and an understanding of how that use case is applicable to the business, you can't even start the journey of understanding what in the world would I buy, rent, or lease to go do this work. And then even when we get there, it's important to put that often it may not live in the cloud at the end, but the cloud is often the most seamless, generic, flexible, least cost place to go experiment, play, and prove out. It is not uncommon for us to talk to organizations that are heavily regulated, but either tokenized, de-identified, or sample data working in an environment in the cloud that I can use for the time period I need to prove out the value is far more appealing than going and buying big kit to go build something out that, to Josh's point early, 80% of these endeavors still fail to make it to production. So the need really does drive the placement. And even if you're coming from the perspective of we're dealing with a form of data that absolutely, positively, no questions asked, cannot be in a cloud environment, we must own it. I would still tell people that experimenting in a safe place before spending a lot of money is the safest place to do that. And this whole conversation today is, once we've identified that it is viable, then how do we wrap our arms around putting the other principles around that so that we can either put it in our data center or put it at our edge? And I think a lot of things go to working with companies that make this a lot easier. There's a lot of buzz out there. There's a lot of capability. And while some people may want to build everything from a text prompt in a black box with green text, we think that the Dell offers flexibility, everything from edge components up to monolithic 8-way storage systems with GPUs. And then NVIDIA with the Enterprise AI Suite helps people build more seamlessly, more quickly, more repeatable. And the tools are at your fingerprints to have a scalable methodology to both explore an AI, but build for production.
Yeah, I think, Mike, a lot of this too is just the idea that how do we get teams to focus on the right points in the value chain? So much like technologies multiple times before this, and it does feel very akin in certain circumstances to the cloud revolution of a decade ago to me, which is how do we make sure that people are focusing on the right components of the stack that ultimately are uniquely challenging for their organization that provide value? And how do we get them to care less about the things that are like well-defined, opinionated, portable, and available to them throughout this process? And I don't think we want to sugarcoat this, right? Like some of these stacks are complex, right? A series of not only infrastructure components that maybe some of our teams are not traditionally familiar with, but ultimately a tremendous amount of software componentry that goes into making like the full life cycle of model development through model deployment and ultimately operational use. That's a complex stack of stuff, right? And if we want to complicate that even further by saying we want to be able to experiment and think through things in cloud and then ultimately repatriate components of them and deploy them in inference ecosystems within our data centers and at our edge, it becomes really incumbent on us as decision makers within IT to try to simplify this wherever humanly possible so that our teams can take advantage of it as fast as possible. And so we're at Ahead, obviously, extremely excited about what we collectively can build with Dell, NVIDIA, and our cloud partners, frankly, in support of that entire life cycle and to try to make that as easy as humanly possible for your teams to not only consume as they get started, but frankly, consistently scale and have portability as those use cases permeate across your enterprise. And I think, one of my personal favorite examples of kind of bringing all of this work together across the use case development and infrastructural layer pieces, and ultimately the process and operational changes really is from one of our kind of most innovative banking clients at this point. And I think what I'd like you to kind of take away from this isn't that you need to be a large scale global bank in order to accomplish this. It's the how they thought through, with help from folks like NVIDIA and Dell and Ahead, the way to go about this, not only to start exposing these capabilities to generate that ideation funnel very quickly, but the rapidness and parallelization involved in getting these things out, right, within their environment. And so, in November of 2023, we started working with them and they started thinking through this concept of how do we start getting the right ideas into the funnel? And I think, frankly, we now look back on that and realize it was entirely the wrong question. Having a funnel in general and exposing people to the idea that we could potentially solve problems for them using these types of technologies in and of itself created an absolute tsunami of potential things to work on. In fact, they had an intake of over 500 different ideas within the first 14 days of that process being released to their users. And that really made them realize very quickly that they needed to establish an organization within their organization to help sort through and prioritize and frankly formalize a lot of these processes, while at the same time getting better ideas directly correlative to how much education they put back into the organization that helped people frame what they needed to work on better, faster, and more frequently. And in parallel, they needed to work on the right type of environment, the right platforms underneath that to really foster their ability to experiment and bring these ideas to scale. And so while I don't want to drain that diagram, broadly speaking, I think the thing that we take away from it is really, one, that the AI hub construct dramatically accelerated their ability to sort through a treasure trove of potential optimization opportunities across the organization. And they were able to get from their first set of POVs to their first set of production use cases in under 45 days once that process started. And then went from actual production deployments and internal testing to an externally facing customer deployed AI use case in the form of what they call Trust Advisor within less than 8 months from the initiation of the program from the CEO, broadly speaking. And so we really look at this and say, if we look at that operating model and you start dissecting it into things that you need to do, this is achievable, right? It is something that we can work on. It needs to be parallelized across a wide swath of people within your organization that represent different areas and different perspectives in order to enable this type of an outcome. But ultimately, it's not impossible to deploy AI production-ready workloads, not just internally, but in customer-facing scenarios, even in a highly regulated environment, if you have the right people at the table.
And we've talked about this several times today, and we gave it its own slide towards the end to kind of do the sandwich of make sure you don't forget this. But if there's one thing you take away from the points of this I've spoken about today, is AI is changing unbelievably quickly. And to drive that home, the very first OpenAI model they had internally, GPT-1, was 100 million parameters. And you fast forward to the release of Gemini Ultra at 1.6 trillion parameters, and you could see the scale at which all of this is changing. And I can give a real life use case of how model portability and the ability to iterate quickly becomes paramount. That we were asked at one point in time to figure out how could we do summarization of training sessions to identify knowledge gaps, to do feedback over a 4-hour presentation. And at that point in time, the models available to do development against did not have a large enough context window to summarize and in one fell swoop get the reasonable information they were looking for. And it became an exercise in, we need you to restructure how you do your training so it's more segmented so that we can get reasonable summarization within those time slices. And then you woke up one day and Gemini Ultra had such a large context window that we could have gone double the time and gotten one contiguous feedback from that without having to change anything that we were doing from the front end development stage. And I say that because a lot of organizations are investing time and they're investing money in building AI applications. And one of the core tenets you have to be prepared to deal with is that the models are point in time. They are going to iterate, and you have to be prepared to replace them. You have to build continuous integration pipelines into your large language model embedded applications in such a way that you're not reinventing the wheel every time you have to do fine tuning with the same piece of data, the same corpus of data. Your strategies for how you rationalize that and do embeddings, if you want to get the technical term, have to be repeatable. And over time, this all shifts to the right because time doesn't stop for the application, which is counterintuitive to the way a lot of applications have been developed in the past. The next thing, and it's right here, is this idea of a router going to a composition or a mixture of experts, depending on what terminology you want to use. We're all familiar with asking very broad or even very pointed questions to a model like GPT or Copilot, and we get a generic answer. But the more we get into something that has domain expertise to it, the more it doesn't make sense to ask a model about legal document summarization, as is germane to the state of Colorado, when it also knows all the works of Shakespeare and the history of the universe. And what we find is getting smaller distilled models that get fine-tuned for their very particular purpose is where the industry is going. And think of a good example of that is you're all 50 states in the territory of Puerto Rico law firm, and you want to create a customer intake system where you identify, should we take the case, is it relevant, and more importantly, what are the nuances of the state in which this event happened. And you wind up finding yourself in a situation where trying to get that from a control framework perspective across one model is almost impossible. But understanding from the intake that this is applicable to New Jersey, for example, I send it to my domain expert model that's applicable to New Jersey. And then I reassemble that back and give the output to my user. And then even then, as case law changes and new cases have been won or new rulings have happened, it's an easy way to explain how these models cannot be point in time. You have to have some form of periodicity where you bring the life cycle into this and you bring it in. So what I would say is experiment often, iterate fast, but be prepared from the onset to build these applications in such a manner that you haven't painted yourself into a corner and you can experiment and change the back end model so you could be successful over time, not just today.
Well said. So I think if we look at kind of key takeaways from today's discussion, we really want to boil this down into what we would kind of think of as 4 key areas. The first is we think it's absolutely critical that you start thinking about the way that you can establish an AI hub within your organization and who the members of that appropriate cross-functional team are and how you can bring broader sponsorship, frankly, into that framework. This is certainly an area where we'd love to be able to help kind of instill the things that we've learned through doing this with a number of different clients and kind of working through the trials and tribulations of that particular effort. 2 is, before you even start deploying things, we need to start thinking about the way ops and integration play into that overall ecosystem. And because this presents new challenges, we have to think about how do we mature things around our pipeline creation and ultimately start thinking about lifecycle management, to Mike's previous point, as a core component of our production deployments. We want to look about how we platform optimize, right? So how do we make sure that we have the right infrastructure, the right software platforms, the right portability of what we're trying to do to ensure that we can start deploying into those environments and that those environments represent the level of criticality and reliability that the business is now going to expect when something goes from a cool idea and experiment to something they now rely upon as critical to business process. And then the last is don't sleep on change management, right? Just because these things are cool doesn't mean that everyone's at the same level of understanding how to use them and how to maximize the value of their use. And so this idea of enablement is going to be absolutely crucial when we take something to production and we hope to get things out of that and manage it over time. So with that, I kind of wanted to just very briefly talk about the fact that our teams that have been working the last 2 to 3 years, frankly, at this point, specifically in response to not just generative components, but a long list of data needs behind that and earlier in that process to help come up with particular offerings that we think align to the specific needs that we just put out. And so whether that's more of the strategy and road mapping pieces, helping you figure out how to build that hub, whether it's in the infrastructure layer and placement and predictability around those pieces, or whether it's in the way that you think through the use of that data that's ultimately going to feed into these systems and result from them, AHEAD is here to be able to help you both from a services, product, and consulting side along that entire journey. So with that, we want to obviously save a little bit of time for questions and answers. So I don't know, Mike, if we saw anything come through in the Q&A.
I don't see anything in the Q&A. This is your opportunity. If you want to ask a question, you can use the question widget and we can see it.
And for the sake of, kind of answering some things that I think that we typically hear through this process and working with clients, Mike, I know we've done a lot of engagements at this point. I just try to distill, I think, some of the things that I see most commonly. So by no means an exhaustive list of questions from clients, but certainly something that we see frequently. So the first is really like, well, what process adjustments are necessary to move an AI project from experimentation to scalable production environment? Well, I think we've kind of talked through a number of the elements of what you need to do here, but I think the reality of that is, one, we need to be very, very close to the business, right? These are not technology deployments that ultimately, are just isolated scenarios that need to get deployed. They're business impacting and business process change management elements. And so ultimately, I think we're looking at it from a perspective of not only what technology processes and what governance needs to be put in place, but ultimately, how do we deal with and work through the change management for the actual underlying business processes that are ultimately being impacted as well. Number two is, what operational changes should we anticipate to monitor, maintain, and update AI models in production? And how do we build teams around those needs? Mike, I don't know if you have specific thoughts there, but.
The operational changes are back to that flywheel approach. We have to understand, how do we do this as we update models? We have to reevaluate what are our guardrail principles, what are our synthetic transactions we're doing to gauge the efficacy of the answers that we're getting. And just like you do with quality assurance and user acceptance test and modern application development, we have to put those same principles into this, and then still have that use base. So going back and doing blue-green testing of, we've made a back-end model change, how can we put this into the hands of critical users to understand if what we've made from a change perspective is both valuable, but ensure that we haven't broken functionality that previously existed. And as we do that, building that into our iterative plannings and steps of how do we build this and how do we go forth and do this. The monitor is very important, right? We look at things that have gotten some of the large AI platform companies, I wouldn't say in trouble, but in hot water, is very, very bad answering as they've done fine tuning or tried to implement different guardrail strategies around their prompt engineering. And it's the same thing as doing front-end web monitoring with synthetic transactions. It's, again, as you go into this, it's finding these core barometer type questions that you can ask of a prompt and ensure that the answers aren't deviating, or they aren't deviating by a much that you would consider that to be drift that's problematic. And then knowing that at some point that will happen, that goes into your integration process of, how do we roll these back? How do we get to a safe starting point without having a model or an application that's otherwise been disturbed by the changes that we made to it?
For sure. I think to your point too, on models changing frequently, we're starting to see more adoption of kind of blue-green testing, right, and evaluation methodologies that run some of these changes in parallel, as opposed to kind of simple swap out mechanisms. So it's kind of critical that you have robust evaluation mechanisms in place, knowing that just because we deployed GPT-4o as a core model today doesn't mean that when GPT-5 comes out, it will behave in the exact same ways that we're traditionally accustomed to in the previous iterations of those models. So we do think that evaluation piece has got to be really significant before we just kind of switch through or swap out particular components of a production tool chain or pipeline. The next one we get all the time. So AHEAD works extensively in highly regulated environments. And so certainly, we talk to a lot of CISOs and legal teams that are focused on, okay, it's great that we want to do these things, but how can we start to ensure a better alignment around our risk management needs and our compliance considerations as we start scaling these things out? And the reality is that the regulatory environment really hasn't necessarily kept up with the speed, frankly, or veracity of what's going on in AI. And we wouldn't necessarily expect that to be something that coalesces in the near term. But the good news is that we can apply, and many of the major risk management frameworks have built mechanisms for us to be able to understand our processes and our specific actions against these deployments in a way that's measurable, and the controls can be easily put in place to make sure that we are aligned to our proposed risk factors in the organization. And then we need to look at your core compliance and regulatory needs within your industry and compare that to how we anticipate the use of these models or the integration of these models within your core environment. And obviously this varies dramatically in terms of internal use versus external exposure to your downstream customers, clients, and users.
I love the last question, because the last question is often defined as the first question. right? A problem well stated is half its solution. And I hate doing IT for the sake of doing IT's sake. And if we've done good ideation, we've done good metrics evaluation, and we have a business problem that we're reasonably trying to solve, oftentimes the KPIs that we're measuring against become self-evident. You know, one of the conversations I have when I go into a customer that wants to ideate on something, and it might sound like a great idea, is how are you going to measure that? And the reality is, if your idea isn't even measurable, it isn't an idea to go waste any time on. And so when we get into that, a lot of times we attempt to validate this in the POV stage. So if I think I'm going to get X number of hours back by end user optimization, or I'm going to generate revenue by doing something, and we've defined that as a KPI, in the small scale, we try to validate what we theorized was going to happen. And then when we get into production, it's really twofold. One is we want to scale that oftentimes as linearly as possible. And if we can get better performance or get more interesting results, that is fantastic. But we want to ensure that it's both, are we getting the KPI at scale we saw in our limited use case? Are we doing any feedback loop mechanisms to identify change that could improve upon that? Are we getting any feedback mechanisms that we've done something incorrectly, we need to change the way we're doing it, we're actually hindering what we intended to do, or at least not getting the maximization of what we intended to do from how we rolled this out? And then like any other observability or application performance management type of program, as we iterate on this on time, we want to ensure that the efficacy, end user performance, and response accuracy of an AI capable application doesn't degrade over time. So we aren't just looking at, did we map to the business KPIs we set out to do, but what were our key performance indicators on the performance of the application on its own, and ensuring that we bring that into our management scope as the application matures over time.
Awesome. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us for part 3 of our webinar series on creating success and value out of AI. We want to once again thank our partner Dell for support for this particular series, and remind you that all of the 3 sessions will be available in video on demand, link to be sent out shortly. We appreciate you joining us for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you.